All right, well, let's get started. Thanks so much for joining us today for today's webinar on why intrinsic motivation and psychological safety are the keys to unlocking employee creativity and innovation, which is brought to you by Attuned. Drawing on decades of academic research into psychology behind intrinsic motivation, Attuned's AI-powered software makes the hidden values that drive people visible. This allows managers to understand their teams on a whole new level, offering insights and actions to enhance communication, boost engagement and productivity, improve psychological safety, and ultimately make work more meaningful. My name is Kristine Ayuzawa. I'm Director of People Operations here at EQIQ, which is part of the group company of which Attuned is a part. And it's my pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Melissa. Melissa has her Ph.D. in clinical psychology. She is currently a member of Attuned's R&D team, and she's leading our project to develop a psychological safety assessment and intervention service. Melissa was originally an expert on intrinsic motivation, and she's getting ready to add psychological safety to that list. As part of her work through Attuned, she's spent the last year doing a deep dive into the scientific literature, meeting with other psychological safety experts, and generally thinking deeply about psychological safety from morning till night. And it is nighttime for Melissa and I, as it's 12 o'clock in the morning here. And I'm sure we're reaching you at a variety of times throughout the day as well. Today, we're looking forward to having her share some insights from her work, and I'm going to pass things over to her. Again, I'll be around. If there's comments or questions, you can drop them into the chat, and I'll be kind of helping to keep an eye on things behind the scenes. But for now, I'll pass it over to you, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Kristine, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion. So let's get started and jump right in. So I'm going to begin this presentation by talking about what psychological safety is. So psychological safety refers to the feeling of comfort or safety that arises when employees believe two things are true. First, when employees perceive that they are valued by their coworkers. In other words, when they believe that their coworkers recognize and appreciate their value as both employees and people. You know, it makes it really hard to feel safe when you believe your coworkers think you're incompetent or unlikable. And second, when employees believe that engaging in socially risky behaviors will not result in negative outcomes such as being embarrassed, misunderstood, harshly judged, rejected, or unfairly punished. And by socially risky behaviors, I mean the kind of behaviors that are essential to work and innovation, such as sharing ideas and knowledge, reporting and learning from mistakes, asking for help, and coming up with innovative solutions, etc. So I want to try to make psychological safety more concrete by asking everyone watching this presentation to think about their own teams, either current or past. Specifically, I want you to ask yourself, is my team psychologically safe? Please include your team leader or manager when thinking about your team. In order to answer this question, consider things like, how much time do you spend preparing for interactions with your teammates out of concern about the interaction going badly in some way? How often do you avoid doing something like talking during meetings or asking questions, etc., because you're worried about how your teammates will react? How much time do you spend reflecting after finishing an interaction, dissecting how the other person reacted to what you said or did? If you or your teammates are doing more planning, avoiding, dissecting, or worrying than you normally would in interactions outside of work, then that's a sign that your team is unsafe. So with that, please let us know if your team is safe by participating in this anonymous poll. And I want to emphasize the poll is anonymous. Your name will not be connected to your response.
We're starting to get some responses already. So thanks for everyone who's clicking on the poll. We'll give it just another couple of seconds. So if you haven't already responded, please do. But I'm seeing two really clear leaders here, and it's right now a bit of a tie, which is really interesting to see. If you haven't already responded to the poll, please go ahead and jump in there. All right. I think that should be just about everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'll share the results with everybody here now as well. Yeah,
These
so we're
look great,
seeing,
right?
yeah, quite a lot of psychologically safe teams.
Mhm, mhm,
47% of respondents said that yes, your teams are psychologically safe. And
mhm.
the other big leader here was somewhere in between. So maybe we'll pick up some ideas or actionable steps you can take to move the needle a little bit more decisively in the direction of psychological safety.
Yeah, and thanks so much for everybody for participating, and hopefully kind of reflecting on your own teams help to make the concept a little more clear. All right, so now let's talk about what are the benefits of psychological safety. And there are many. PS or psychological safety has been connected to a range of benefits that are of central importance to companies across industries and countries. Furthermore, psychological safety's role in creating these benefits has been shown to be both strong and direct. So, next, I'm going to zoom in on just a few of these. So, one thing I assume that all companies care about is performance, and psychological safety appears to have an essential role in unlocking performance. For example, researchers found psychological safety to be associated with greater goal achievement and greater return on assets. You may have also heard about Google's Project Aristotle, which is a massive research study that looked at 250 different team characteristics to try to find which ones were the strongest predictors of a team's effectiveness. And they found psychological safety was the number one predictor of team effectiveness, number one out of 250 different characteristics. And researchers give multiple reasons why psychological safety has such a positive impact on performance. For example, they say it liberates members to act in ways that are beneficial to the team's performance. So remember all those socially risky behaviors that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, like proposing innovative solutions to problems, seeking help and feedback, and speaking up about concerns before they develop into crises? All of these behaviors are necessary and essential for a team to be successful and productive. And all these behaviors are a direct consequence of psychological safety. In other words, if people feel safe, they will do them. If people feel unsafe, they won't do them. It's as simple as that. Psychological safety also just saves time. When it's present, employees don't have to do 10 rounds of editing on every email they send out to teammates or spend an hour planning how to say something to the team leader. Psychological safety is also valued because it makes change go better. Undergoing change means undergoing a learning process, learning the new ways that are being ushered in. And while people are learning, they're making mistakes and performance can be somewhat low. So employees need to feel protected and valued to be willing to open themselves up to the risk associated with making mistakes and lowered performance. And that sense of security is exactly what psychological safety offers. But getting employees on board is not even half the struggle. Whatever change plan is adopted needs to work in reality. Companies need to be leveraging local knowledge to ensure the change process is optimized based on the realities of the job, and doing so in real time, catching issues as they arise. And that is so much easier to do when you have employees contributing their voice to the change process, because they are the ones with local knowledge. They are the ones on the ground, able to catch the small problems that fly under the radar of HR and executives. But employees will only contribute their voices when they feel safe enough to do so. And research backs up the idea that psychological safety is important for change. In fact, it's seen as so important that researchers have said that the centerpiece of any change process in companies should be to increase climate factors such as psychological safety before larger changes and innovations are tackled. Psychological safety is also good for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. If you want to attract and retain a diverse workforce, you have to make all employees feel like they belong. Because, as research has shown, a sense of belonging is essential for all employees to thrive and be successful in their jobs. But a sense of belonging can only exist under a specific set of circumstances. It can only exist when, one, people feel like they can be their true and complete selves, and two, when they feel like they are essential and valuable members of the group. So, in order to feel a sense of belonging on your team, you have to show your true self to your teammates. For example, by telling personal stories. You have to contribute to the team in valuable ways, for example, by sharing ideas. And these kind of behaviors can feel very risky for employees. And that is especially true for individuals from underrepresented minority groups who face greater uncertainty about whether their teammates will be able to understand, identify with, or appreciate their true selves, or if their teammates are going to be interpreting their contributions through the filter of a negative bias. And psychological safety helps employees to achieve that sense of belonging on their team by making them feel comfortable enough to show their true selves to their teammates and to feel safe and invited to contribute to the team. And indeed, researchers back up this notion by highlighting psychological safety as an essential ingredient for attracting and retaining individuals from underrepresented minority groups. And now to highlight the benefit that you're all here for, to hear about how psychological safety is a key tool for unlocking employee creativity and innovation. So human beings love to be romantic about life and the human condition and to create romantic tales about ourselves. Falling in love is mysterious. Finding meaning in life is mysterious. The act of thinking and using it to produce innovation or art is mysterious. And so to describe and enhance the fantasy of these mysteries, we come up with great words like creativity. But actually, creativity is just thinking. It just happens to be thinking that leads to results that we think are great. And the definition of creativity that we're going to use here today is production of ideas, products, or procedures that are novel or original and potentially useful to the employing organization. As such, creativity is a process of idea generation and problem solving. In other words, it's thinking that produces results that are new and useful. I also want to quickly define the term innovation. I'm going to be using it somewhat interchangeably with creativity, but they are different. Essentially, creativity is the generation of new and potentially useful ideas, while innovation is the successful implementation of creative ideas into a functional reality. And when most people hear the words creativity and innovation, they think of jobs like graphic designers, marketing, R&D, etc. And of course, those jobs are relevant to today's discussion. But the creativity and innovation I'm talking about today can also occur in much less obvious ways and in virtually all job roles and all job industries, which hopefully by the end of this presentation will become more obvious. And companies should care about innovation and creativity because creative behaviors at work are essential for addressing new and changing demands in the workplace and for remaining competitive. And right now, many companies are in a crisis state because of the pandemic. And during times like this, there's a tendency to go into survival mode where companies de-emphasize innovation and narrow their strategic focus. However, research during and after the 2008 financial crisis found that companies that continued to invest in innovation outperformed their peers during recovery, with some outperforming by as much as 30%. And for a long time, the way people thought about creativity was as some individual characteristic or talent, something that you're just born with. However, over the last half century, researchers have been demonstrating that, in fact, environment plays a huge role in creativity. All humans with typical levels of cognitive ability can be creative if they're in an environment or context that allows them to be. And psychological safety has been shown to be one of those environmental contextual variables that is important for unlocking and nurturing individuals' creativity. In fact, researchers have called it one of the most important contextual environmental variables. And in order to demonstrate this, I want to do another little thought experiment with you. So I want everyone watching this presentation to stop for a second and imagine yourself as a staff member at a hotel. Imagine yourself alone at the front desk at 2 a.m. in the morning while your manager is at home sleeping soundly in their bed. And a guest comes down to the front desk with a complaint that you have never heard of before, and the hotel has never had to deal with before. It is a completely novel problem. What do? You can't go open a manual because the guest issue is totally novel. There is no precedent or guidelines for how to respond. In order to fix this novel issue, you need to come up with a novel solution and one that is effective at solving the guest problem. In other words, the definition of creativity. And you end up coming up with an idea that's actually pretty good. It's definitely different from anything you've been trained to do before. It's definitely off script. However, you feel pretty confident that it's going to work. But whether or not you act on this creative idea is strongly determined by your environment, specifically how psychologically safe your team is. So let's try to imagine what happens to your creative idea if you're on a psychologically safe team, a psychologically unsafe team, excuse me. So try imagining that you're in that moment with the guest standing in front of you and you're asking yourself, should I act on my idea? In order to answer that question, you try to imagine how your team and your manager are going to react when you tell them that you use your creative idea. And let's say you imagine your team reacting in the following way. So you're imagining yourself in the next team meeting, telling your manager how you solved the guest issue with your creative idea. And you notice your manager's face starts turning red. And before you can even finish, your manager cuts you off and says, "What were you thinking? We have protocol around here. You're supposed to help guests, but not come up with your own ideas without permission. Something had gone wrong. It would make me look really bad, and it would be all your fault." And while your team leader is talking, out of the corner of your eye, you notice your teammates glancing at each other with raised eyebrows and smirks on their faces. No one steps in to defend you. No one praises you for trying to help the guest. And then 2 weeks later, you notice that some of your shifts have been cut. So now I want everyone in the audience to stop and think. If this is how you had imagined your team responding, what would you do? Would you act on the idea? I'm going to guess probably not. Instead, you would do something like tell the guests, "Sorry, I can't do anything until my manager arrives in the morning," thus leaving the guest angry and unsatisfied. Or you might call and wake up your manager to ask them what to do, thus disrupting your manager's sleep and forcing the guest to wait shivering in their bathrobe while you're on the phone. Neither sounds like a very good option, right? However, let's imagine a different scenario. This time, when you're asking yourself, should I act on my idea? You imagine your team reacting in the following way. You're imagining yourself at the next team meeting, telling your teammates about the situation of the guest. But this time, you imagine your manager and teammates respectfully listening to you and nodding and smiling while you tell the story. At the end of your story, your manager says, "Wow, what a great idea you had. It's totally different from our usual protocol. So the fact you could come up with that idea on the spot is great. And I'm so happy you were able to provide the guest with an immediate solution." And then your teammates say, "Yeah, great job. Could you show us how you did it in case the same issue comes up again?" If this is a scenario you imagine, what would you do? Most people would act on their idea, thus ending up with happy, satisfied guests and well-slept managers. And the reason psychological safety is so essential for creativity and innovation becomes obvious when you look at the nature of creativity and innovation, specifically when you look at the kinds of socially risky behaviors that are central to innovation and creativity. So I'm going to give a few examples to try to make it more clear why, if companies want to support creativity and benefit from innovation, why they need psychological safety to make employees willing to engage in these socially risky behaviors. First, creativity by its very nature introduces novelty and increases uncertainty. Specifically, it's associated with uncertainty surrounding success and failure. Creative ideas, because they are novel and thus untested, are more likely to fail. Thus, when an employee brings up a creative idea, they are putting themselves at risk of having their idea fail and then being blamed, ostracized, punished, or labeled as incompetent. Creativity is also associated with uncertainty surrounding how one's teammates will react to their idea. Many innovative and creative ideas at first glance seem to be ridiculous or unrealistic. So when an employee brings up a creative idea, they run the risk of having their idea immediately dismissed, being disrespected, feeling embarrassed, etc. Creativity also involves a certain set of thinking skills. If you remember, creativity is defined as the production of things that are novel or original and potentially useful. So originality and novelty are defining characteristics of creativity and innovation. Thus, by definition, in order for creativity and innovation to exist, employees have to be thinking divergently. They have to be generating alternatives. They have to be questioning the status quo and challenging norms. But doing those things can feel very risky for employees. Employees worry that they'll be perceived as disruptive, rude, not a team player, not aligned with the company and team's vision, etc. Furthermore, if you want to turn creativity into innovation, a team has to be able to engage in certain kinds of communication and collaboration. Specifically, there needs to be honest, open, non-defensive communication among teammates that allows a team to think through creative ideas fully and to tweak them to make them more viable. But this kind of communication is hampered when employees are defensive in response to negative feedback or dismissive of certain team members' expertise, etc. So, in order for a team to be able to take and engage in the socially risky behaviors involved in creativity and innovation, that is, in order for employees to be willing to open themselves up to uncertainty, to engage in divergent thinking, and to be able to utilize open, honest communication, you have to remove their fears about punishment, embarrassment, getting labeled as disruptive, etc. You have to have team members who are open to hearing critical feedback and who see value in the contributions and ideas of all teammates. And all those things are exactly what psychological safety does. They are the definition of psychological safety, which is why psychological safety is so necessary for creativity and innovation. And as a part of this webinar, I also promised that I would discuss intrinsic motivation and its role alongside psychological safety in supporting creativity and innovation. So there's a long tradition of companies and researchers trying to understand, categorize, and predict employee motivation, because motivation is a central factor in employee performance. And the thought is that if you can understand employee motivation, then you can optimize employee performance. Traditionally, when people conceptualized employee motivation, they thought of it as occurring along one dimension. Motivation is either high or it's low, or somewhere in between those two poles. However, decades of research has shown that there is another dimension along which you can understand and categorize motivation. And that dimension is the extent to which motivation comes from a source that is internal to us versus external to us. Another way to state it is the extent to which motivation feels voluntary versus involuntary. So basically, does the individual feel like they're performing the behavior because they want to, or because they're being pushed or forced to? Motivation that feels like it's voluntary, like it has an internal source, that is called intrinsic motivation. And motivation that feels involuntary, or like its source is external to us, that is called extrinsic motivation. So let's talk about intrinsic motivation, the kind of motivation that comes from an internal source and is experienced as voluntary. Intrinsic motivation, in its purest form, at the very farthest end of the pole that you see, is it's motivation for things that we find interesting or enjoyable. When intrinsically motivated for an activity, the act of performing the activity is the reason that we're doing it. In other words, the actual behavior itself is what is rewarding. For example, playing video games, spending time with friends, going on vacation, reading an interesting novel, etc. We don't play video games because it's going to help us do well in school, or because our parents are making us, or because it's going to get us money we need to pay bills. Instead, we do it because we find the act of playing video games interesting and enjoyable. So the source of motivation is our internal feelings of interest and enjoyment. And it feels very voluntary because the only reason we're doing it is because we want to be doing it. The opposite end of that spectrum would be extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is functioning while you're reading an interesting novel in a hammock on the beach, but extrinsic motivation functions when you're reading a boring textbook because it's going to help you get good grades in school. And the act of reading the textbook is not enjoyable. In fact, it might even be somewhat unpleasant. So you're not reading the textbook voluntarily. Instead, you're reading the textbook because of the external motivation of getting good grades in school. And motivation can occur anywhere between those two poles. So for example, it's possible for someone to perform a behavior for extrinsic reasons, but still feel a sense of voluntariness and enjoyment. And I think this point is very relevant for understanding work-related motivation, because most people go to work for the extrinsic reason of getting money. However, it's possible for companies and managers to structure the work environment such that employees feel a sense of voluntariness. They feel a sense of interest and enjoyment from going to work. Thus, even though they're technically extrinsically motivated, their motivation and the benefits produced by it are much more similar to intrinsic motivation. And the reason that there's such a focus on intrinsic and intrinsic-like motivation is because research has shown that the more intrinsic and voluntary an individual's motivation is, the harder and longer they work, the more they persist in the face of barriers, the more fully and creatively they engage in their work, the more meaningful they find their work, the more benefit they get to their psychological well-being, etc. And intrinsic motivation has been given a central role in creativity. It's been called the main motivator of creativity. And it's thought that people are most creative when they are motivated primarily by the interest, enjoyment, satisfaction, and challenge of the work itself, that is, by intrinsic motivation. So it behooves companies and managers to do what they can to make the work environment as friendly to intrinsic motivation as possible, to help employees feel a sense of voluntariness, interest, and enjoyment. So now let's connect all the pieces and discuss how does psychological safety, intrinsic motivation, and creativity relate to each other. So it appears that psychological safety and intrinsic motivation can be a super powerful two-pronged approach to unlocking creativity and innovation, among other things. Researchers have referred to them as equal partners and said that both should be present for excellence. And I think their partnership can be explained using the metaphor of this car with a lock on its wheel. In order to be able to drive this car, there needs to be two conditions that are true. First, the car has to have gas. It needs to have the fuel that will make it move forward, give it the power to take action. Second, you need to get that yellow lock that is on the wheel off. That lock is a barrier, so even when there's a full tank of gas, the car can't move forward with that lock on. And this car is a great metaphor for our discussion today. Creativity and innovation is the car. Intrinsic motivation is the fuel that drives the creativity and innovation. And psychological safety removes the barriers that stop the creativity and innovation from moving forward. And this notion is backed up by some of the leading psychological safety researchers, or should I say the leading psychological safety researcher, Harvard University's Dr. Amy Edmondson, who our company recently had the honor of getting to interview. When asked about the connection between psychological safety and intrinsic motivation during our interview, Dr. Edmondson said, psychological safety needs to be coupled with intrinsic motivation for employees to be willing not only to take social risks, but to just keep striving, to keep pushing themselves to do better, to keep pushing teammates to do better. And Dr. Edmondson continued her explanation by referencing this graphic she made, which many of you may recognize. So in Dr. Edmondson's original version of this graphic, there is a psychological safety on the vertical dimension and accountability or performance standards on the horizontal dimension. However, Dr. Edmondson said that you could replace accountability with intrinsic motivation and that it would make a lot of sense to do so because in an environment where you have neither psychological safety nor intrinsic motivation, you're going to experience apathy, where you just don't care enough to take interpersonal risks, let alone to try very hard at whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. But when both intrinsic motivation and psychological safety are high, that's when you enter into the high performance zone. And in the context of the current presentation, that would be the creativity zone. And when employees are in this zone, they are not only able and unafraid to take social risks required for creative work involvement, but they are also willing and motivated to do so. So at this point, you may be thinking, all right, I'm convinced. Now give me the goods. How do we do this? And that's what I'm about to tell you right now. How to create the psychological safety and intrinsic motivation that will unlock employee creativity and innovation. So if you remember, creativity and innovation involve things like a high risk of failure, a need to experiment with ideas, challenging norms, disagreeing, pointing out alternatives, and being vulnerable with your teammates by sharing your ideas that may initially be seen as ridiculous or unrealistic. Thus, if you want to support creativity and innovation at your company, you're going to need to create a culture in which people feel both safe and motivated to do these things. And I'm going to give you some strategies specifically focused on these areas. The first tip is to have a non-punitive response to failures. What this looks like is, first, not punishing well-intentioned mistakes or failures. And notice that I said well-intentioned failure. If someone is knowingly being irresponsible or careless, that's a different story. That's not what I'm referring to right now. What I'm referring to now are failures and mistakes that are an inevitable part of experimentation that is at the core of creativity and innovation. So in that context, if an employee fails, do not punish them, do not give them a negative evaluation, do not lose confidence in them. They should experience no retribution for their failure. Furthermore, in responding to the failure, do not focus on blame, do not spend time trying to figure out who's at fault or forcing people to justify themselves, etc. Instead, respond to the failure calmly with an attitude of curiosity and interest. Treat everyone involved with the failure with respect, dignity, and compassion. Give everyone a chance to explain their side of the story and try to find ways to reduce their stress about the failure. Also, take a problem-solving approach to the failure. What this looks like is teammates promptly stepping in to provide help and support to fix any issues that arose because of the failure. And the team should spend time discussing the failure in a non-judgmental, objective way with the goal of using the failure to learn and improve. Another strategy is the creation of failure positive norms. This means doing things like normalizing the occurrence of failure and emphasizing that failure is inevitable when you're engaging in innovation and trying new things. Thus, sending the message that not only is failure okay, it is expected. Another way to create this norm is to have open discussions about failure. One of the easiest ways to do this is to have people, especially the team leader, share stories about their own mistakes and failures, including telling how they were able to learn from that failure experience. So on the surface, this tip may seem primarily relevant for psychological safety, but it's also good for intrinsic motivation. When a team is comfortable with failures, that removes external pressures to perform well and hit targets. And whenever you remove those external pressures or those extrinsic motivating forces, that allows the intrinsic motivation to bloom. And I want to clarify that not all extrinsic motivation is bad for creativity, but when it comes in the form of externally imposed fear or shame about failure, then it's going to stifle creativity. The second tip is to be autonomy supportive and provide employees with discretionary power whenever possible. Being autonomy supportive means providing choice whenever possible, giving employees a convincing rationale for decisions and rules, etc., reducing the amount of surveillance or watching over and checking everything employees are doing, providing both space and time for employees to be able to express their concerns and ask questions, and reducing employees' fears about overstepping boundaries. Being autonomy supportive also means giving employees discretionary power. Remember earlier in the presentation when you were a staff member working at a hotel? If you had not had the discretionary power to decide how to respond to that guest's issue, then you would not have had a chance to use your creative solution to help the guest. And giving employees discretionary power looks like giving them the authority to make decisions, giving them the authority to design, plan, and manage their own creative tasks, such as allowing employees to decide their own methods for completing tasks and setting their own pace of work. Okay, so this brings us to our third tip, creating a culture in which the team is open to and values new and diverse ways of thinking. In order to create that norm, teams can do things like celebrate change and newness, explicitly encourage members to think in diverse ways, tell members they are expected to express dissent and disagreement, to challenge norms, and to share disruptive ideas, etc. Team members should also try to be non-defensive. So when one team member questions, challenges, or disagrees with another teammate, they should respond calmly and with openness and curiosity and hear the other individual out. The team could even consider providing members with training and communication skills, specifically training on how to communicate assertively and how to respectfully express disagreement. Not only will this make team members feel more confident and thus more willing to express disagreement, but it will also mean they will be communicating in a way that's less likely to trigger defensiveness. The team should also make it a regular practice of having open and candid discussions of challenging and disruptive ideas. For example, dedicating a part of each team meeting to giving every team member a chance to express dissent or bring up alternatives, etc. And making it a rule during these discussions that no topic is off limits. Everything can be questioned or constructively criticized. My fourth tip is aimed at how teams can help team members feel comfortable to be vulnerable in sharing their out-of-the-box ideas. And not only to feel comfortable, but to feel like their ideas are invited and valued. The first and most obvious way to do this is to ensure that team members are responding to each other's ideas respectfully and without judgment. And the typical strategies apply here, like being aware of your body language, tone of voice, word choice, give feedback constructively, etc. The team could also consider doing things like regularly setting aside time that's dedicated to the sharing of creative ideas in a safe space. For example, the team could schedule a no criticism, no comment brainstorming session where team members are asked to compile all possible solutions to a problem without criticism or even comment from other team members. And finally, even with the most respectful response, people will not contribute unless they feel like their contributions are valued and wanted. Thus, I recommend doing things like explicitly inviting contribution from all team members. This means making sure everyone on the team has been directly asked and given time to contribute an idea, even team members who are low on the totem pole or whose expertise is not directly relevant to the topic under discussion. Furthermore, always express, both explicitly and implicitly, appreciation and valuing of ideas, or at least the willingness to share ideas. And my final tip to you is to avoid mixed messaging. This may be the most challenging and difficult of all the tips to achieve, but it is maybe the most important. First, this means being consistent and applying all the tips I just gave you. For example, you need to make your response to failures be consistent across time, person, and situation. But it also means stepping back and looking at the overall messaging that you're sending employees. Some examples of common mixed messages that can damage employee motivation and safety are a manager telling their team, we've got to be innovative, but it's got to be perfect and done on time. That is a mixed message because mistakes and imperfections are inherent to the process of creativity. You can't have perfection and innovation at the same time. So it's forcing employees into a choice between being innovative and not getting in trouble. And most people are going to choose the not getting in trouble route. Another example of a common mixed message is having a team or company culture which emphasizes the way to get ahead around here is to make your targets. That encourages employees to set low targets and stick to what they know well and avoid innovation, because that's easier to do than trying to meet ambitious targets involving creativity. All right, so this is bringing us to the end of our presentation. Today, we got to talk about what psychological safety and intrinsic motivation are, why they are a super powerful two-pronged approach to supporting creativity and innovation. And then I gave you 5 tips for how to create psychological safety and intrinsic motivation that lead to creativity and innovation. And before I completely finish, I want to encourage all of you to go and listen to our employee Tanya's interview with Dr. Amy Edmondson. To listen, please visit Tanya's Substack that's listed at the bottom of this slide at whywouldyanyone@tanya.substack.com. Her interview was filled with great insights that you can't get anywhere else. All right, that's all for me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I've been learning along with everyone else here at Attuned about intrinsic motivation and psychological safety over the years, but that image of the car with the boot on the front wheel really is going to stick in my mind as a great visual for keeping in mind this two-pronged approach of making sure we have the fuel with intrinsic motivation, but also the lack of barriers in terms of getting that wheel unlocked. So I really appreciate it. One of the questions that I've seen pop up a few times in the Q&A is whether we'll be able to share a recording in the slides. And just to reinforce that again, yes, we'll absolutely be sending that stuff around. I would also point you to the Attuned website where you can view all of the webinar recordings, and this one will be there as well. So that can be an easy place to look for it. But through your registration for this webinar, we have your email and we'll be sure to get those resources over to you. We're winding down, but I wanted to follow up on my promise to see if there were any final questions or things that we can try to answer for you while we are live here. You can go ahead and throw them in the Q&A box or raise your hand so we have an idea of what might be out there, and try to give those just a minute or two to come in. No? All right. Well, what I will do is, oh, here we go. I was going to say, I'll just remind you that, Melissa, myself, many of us at the team here at Attuned are also on LinkedIn, and you can go ahead and find us there. You can always reach out to the Attuned team directly through the website, and they'll be able to help you follow up with any queries as well. But the question that's come through here, Melissa, I'll point this back to you. The mixed messaging slide was quite helpful. And this anonymous attendee is wondering if you have any other examples of mixed messages around psychologically safe environments.
Well, that's a good question. I might have to think on that a little bit, but essentially anything where you're saying I'm going to be safe, or this is a safe space. You can bring anything up, but not that one thing. like anything where, yeah, what you're saying is in direct contrast to the reality of the situation or what can be done with psychological safety. Yeah, I'll try to think on it for a second if I can come up with any other good examples. But yeah, for now, I don't know, maybe and another question was, if you're a new leader joining a team that did not feel safe, what is the best way to start building psychological safety? A new leader joining a team. That's interesting. So yeah, usually we talk about it's the team members who are feeling unsafe and the team leader who's, I guess they have the power, so they don't feel as safe. But I really think, any psychological safety intervention, if you're trying to build that at your company, start by having a conversation with your team. And again, with that autonomy supportive approach, providing the convincing rationale. So maybe bringing up some slides. I mean, maybe you could even share a recording of this interview, or find Amy Edmondson has a great TED Talks online that you can find, but giving them just reasoning like why this is so important and why you want to bring this to the table on your team. I would also then recommend the next step would be to work with the team to all decide on the rules for what you guys would like psychological safety to look like on your team. For example, agreeing on everybody has equal talking time during meetings, or, we're all going to use have those kind of brainstorming sessions where, it's kind of the safe space. We're not going to comment or criticize, or we're going to wait till the end. So yeah, working with your team to collaboratively come up with your own rules about how you want safety to look like on the team.
There's another one that's come through here, Melissa, and I don't know, this could be one of our last questions, but this participant is looking for tips for when your department is a psychologically safe space, but the institution, maybe at a broader level, is not. And this would be tips for someone who's in the role of a mid-level manager in this kind of organization.
I love this question because I think it demonstrates a really good point about psychological safety, which is that it is really what you call like a team phenomenon. So yeah, you can, if you have your little safe space as a team, but the outside of that, things can feel unsafe. So, or there's even possible to be like between you and one other person, it could feel unsafe. But really, yeah, sometimes the team, or it's even goes the opposite way where the whole company tries to be safe, but then the team itself feels unsafe. So I think, in that case, if you are a mid-level manager and you have power, I might suggest the same thing. Again, just starting with a conversation, bringing in some convincing rationale, and then working and hopefully getting people on board to seeing what they think can be done, how they would like that process to look. So yeah, I think it pretty much looks the same how you would do it on a team versus how you would do it at the wider organizational level, if you have power as a mid-level manager.
Absolutely. And it seems like just being a participant in terms of your reactions, thinking back to your tips over the last couple of slides, Melissa, looking at, how you are intentionally asking certain questions and who you're inviting into the conversation and how you're responding to things, whether it's the way you respond to suggestions that come up, or how you handle things that have gone wrong, or what you're communicating about the definition of success and collaboration, and how all of those things align with the team values and the way you're working together. I can imagine that as a manager, whether you're new to the team or part of a broader management team, that modeling it and really trying to start with yourself and looking at how you're responding to things rather than reacting to things can typically be a good place to start with this type of focus. Yes, and the anonymous attendee who's popped up in the Q&A is saying, for me, it starts with building psychological safety within myself first. And yeah, really focusing, I think, on what you're doing is always a good starting place. All right. Well, we're going to close the Q&A down here. But as I mentioned, just before we got started, you can always reach out to any of us, find us on LinkedIn, find us at Attuned, and reach out. We'd love to talk more about this. And thank you again for all of you for joining us today live. We'll send those resources around, but most of all to Melissa for this fantastic presentation. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Have a great day wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. It's always risky to be too specific there.